The station shook so hard that dust fell from the ceiling like gray snow. I gripped the edge of my console and watched the outer hull temperature climb past every number I had ever trained for. Alarms did not scream anymore. They had given up an hour ago, worn down into a tired, steady hum, as if even the machines understood that no one was coming. My name is Kalen Thess. I was the second officer of Listening Post Doris, a small outpost built to watch the quiet edge of Vale space. We were not a military people. We built libraries, not battleships. We spent our resources on medicine and farming and long, slow conversations between our cities. When the Thresher ships first crossed into our border systems, we sent them a greeting message. They answered with fire. That was 6 days ago. In 6 days, 3 of our worlds went dark. Not damaged, dark. No signals, no ships, no voices. Just silence where millions of people used to be. I sat at the only working transmitter left on Doris and typed the emergency code into the old Concord beacon. My hands were shaking, but I made myself type slowly because a broken signal would not be answered. The Concord beacon was supposed to be sacred. Every spacefaring race that joined the Concord promised, by treaty, to answer it. It did not matter which species sent it. It did not matter how small or how poor that species was. The beacon meant one thing to everyone who heard it. Someone is dying, and they need you now. I sent it 3 times, just to be certain. Then I waited. The first reply came from the Orloon Assembly, a race known for their enormous fleets and their careful, endless meetings. Their reply was polite. It used words like regret and complication and diplomatic caution. It said that engaging the Threshers directly might upset a fragile peace they were negotiating in a completely different part of the galaxy. It wished us well. It did not send a single ship. The second reply came from the Tanis Combine, traders who moved more cargo through more systems than anyone else. Their reply talked about insurance costs and supply routes. They said war was bad for business on both sides, so they preferred to remain neutral. They did not send a single ship. The third reply did not come at all. The Velkar Systems Authority, who had signed the Concord Treaty with great ceremony only 2 years earlier, simply never answered. I stared at the empty channel for almost 20 minutes, hoping some delay in the signal was to blame. It was not delay. It was a choice. One by one, every great power of the galaxy found a reason to look away. I began to understand something painful. The beacon was sacred only when it was convenient. When it was not convenient, it was just noise. Outside the station, a new impact rocked the hull. I heard metal groan somewhere below me, a sound like a large animal in pain. My friend Vessa, who managed our small medical bay, called through the comm to ask how many were left. I told her the truth. Not many, maybe 200 people, crowded into the lower shelters, waiting for either rescue or an ending. I thought about my sister, who lived on one of the 3 worlds that had gone dark. I did not let myself think about her for long, because if I did, I would not be able to keep working, and 200 people needed me to keep working. There was one name left on our old contact list that I had never used: humanity. Humans were strange to us. They had only recently begun moving beyond their own solar system, and their first meetings with the wider galaxy had gone badly. There were stories, half rumor and half warning, about how humans reacted the one time an outside fleet tested their borders many years ago. The details were never clear, but the outcome was. The testing fleet did not test again. After that, the Concord placed humanity under a kind of watchful distance. They were allowed to trade in small ways, allowed to speak at minor councils, but they were never invited to sign the full treaty. Many species quietly agreed this was for the best. Humans were unpredictable, and unpredictable was a word the galaxy did not trust. They had never answered a Concord beacon because they had never been asked to. No one expected them to care about a call that was not addressed to them. I almost did not send it. Vessa's voice was in my ear again, telling me the lower shelter had lost power. I had perhaps minutes left to make any decision at all, so I did the only thing left to try. I opened a private channel. one used only for minor trade contact, and sent our location and our situation to the single human relay station within transmission range. I did not use the formal Concord code. I did not expect a formal answer. I simply wrote, in plain words, that we were dying and that no one else was coming. I did not wait for a reply. There was no time to wait. I closed the channel and turned back to help move the last of our people toward the escape pods, because even without help, we would not stop trying to survive. The Thresher ships tightened around Doris like a fist closing slowly. Their commander, a voice we had heard only once, sent us a final message. It said our resistance was pointless, and that the galaxy had already decided we were not worth saving. I remember how calm that voice sounded, as if cruelty were simply an efficient use of time. I gathered the last few crew members in the corridor outside the shelter. Vesa held the hand of a young boy who had lost his parents 2 systems ago. An old engineer named Doran sat with his back against the wall, quietly repairing a broken lamp, as if light still mattered. Maybe it did, maybe especially then. We had perhaps 30 minutes before the outer shields failed completely. I remember checking the transmitter one last time, more from habit than hope. Nothing. No reply from Orlun, no reply from Tanis, no reply from Velkar, no reply, of course, from humanity, because why would there be? We were nothing to them. A name on a list they had never spoken to. I sat down next to Doran and helped him hold the broken lamp steady while he worked. It felt strange to care about small things while the whole world seemed to be ending, but I think that is what people do when they run out of large things they can control. Then the transmitter chimed. It was such a small sound, almost lost under the noise of the failing station, but I heard it the way you hear your own name spoken across a crowded room. I crossed the corridor faster than I thought my legs could carry me, and opened the channel. There was no long message, no formal greeting, no treaty language, no diplomatic phrasing, none of the careful caution the Orlun or Tanis had used. Just a short string of words, sent back across the very same private channel I had used moments before. Received. Hold position. Do not surrender. I read it 3 times, unsure if I had understood it correctly, because it was so different from every reply we had gotten that day. It did not explain itself. It did not apologize for delay. It did not ask what was in it for them. It simply told us to hold on. Vesa asked me what it meant. I told her the truth, that I did not know, and that we would find out together. The Thresher ships tightened further, their weapons preparing for what their commander clearly believed would be the final blow against us. I felt fear settle into my chest like a stone. But underneath the fear, something else had begun to grow, small and strange and almost unfamiliar after 6 days of silence from everyone who was supposed to care. It was hope, and it had come from the one place none of us had expected it to come from at all. I looked at Doran, still working on his lamp, and at Vesa, still holding the boy's hand, and I said the only thing I could think to say. Someone is coming. I do not know what they will look like, or what they can do, or why they have decided to answer a call that was never meant for them, but someone, finally, is coming. Outside, the stars had not changed. The Thresher fleet had not changed. But far beyond the edge of our sensors, something had shifted in the dark, and none of us yet understood how much that single shift was about to change everything we believed about who the galaxy's true protectors were. I did not sleep. I do not think anyone on Doris slept that night, if night even meant anything anymore inside a station lit only by emergency lamps. We waited in the corridor, listening to the slow groan of the hull and the occasional flash of light through the small viewport where the Thresher fleet still circled us like patient predators who already believed the meal was theirs. Vesa asked me, more than once, what kind of ship humanity would send. I told her I did not know, because it was true. Our records on humanity were thin, mostly second-hand reports passed along by traders who dealt with them at the very edges of Concord space. What we did know did not paint a clear picture. Humans were young among the stars, barely a few generations past their own world, yet somehow already treated with a caution usually reserved for old, powerful empires. I remembered a story my old instructor told me once, back when I was training to work the listening posts. She said that many years ago, before Doris was even built, a fleet from a minor power tested the edge of human space, expecting an easy conquest. Records of what happened next were sealed by mutual agreement between several governments, and no one I had ever met claimed to know the full truth. What was known was simple. That fleet did not return, and no one ever tested humanity's border again. After that, the Concord chose a quiet policy. Humanity was welcome to speak at minor councils, welcome to trade in small measured amounts, but never invited to sign the full defense treaty. Some said this was caution. Others said it was fear dressed up as procedure. I had always assumed that policy meant humans simply did not care about anyone outside their own system. Sitting in that corridor, I began to wonder if it meant something else entirely. Perhaps the galaxy had decided long ago that it was safer to keep humanity at a careful distance, the way you might keep a powerful tool locked in a cabinet, useful only when nothing else worked. Doran finished repairing his lamp near dawn, if dawn meant anything either. He held it up and it flickered weakly, then steadied into a small golden light. He smiled at it the way a father might smile at a child who had just taken their first steps. I asked him why it mattered so much to him, fixing one small lamp while the whole station shook around us. He said that when everything large feels impossible to fix, sometimes fixing one small thing is the only way to remember that fixing anything is still possible. I have thought about those words many times since. At first light, if the dim glow through the cracked viewport could be called that, our sensors picked up a new signature entering the outer system. It was small, far smaller than I expected. I had imagined a fleet, dozens of ships arriving in formation the way Orloon ships always did, all careful spacing and cautious approach vectors. Instead, our sensors showed a single vessel, moving at a velocity our instruments struggled to calculate correctly. The numbers kept adjusting themselves, as if the ship itself refused to follow the rules we had built our sensors to expect. Vessa stood beside me at the console, her hand tight on my shoulder. She asked if the sensors were broken. I told her I did not think so. I told her I thought something was simply moving faster than anything we had built our instruments to measure. The Thresher fleet noticed it too. Their formation, which had been calm and confident for 6 days, shifted for the first time. Ships that had been patiently circling Doris suddenly turned outward, weapons realigning toward the new arrival. Their commander's voice came over an open channel, sharp and demanding, asking the newcomer to identify itself and withdraw immediately from what he called Thresher-controlled space. There was no answer, not a single word. I remember how strange that silence felt, different from the silence we had received from Orloon, or Tanis, or Velkar. Those silences had felt like absence, like nobody was even listening. This silence felt like something entirely different. It felt like someone was listening very carefully and had simply decided that words were not necessary yet. The single vessel did not slow down. It did not attempt to negotiate a safe path around the Thresher formation the way any cautious captain would. It moved directly toward the heart of the fleet, and for one terrible moment, I thought we were about to watch a single small ship destroy itself against dozens of larger warships, sacrificing itself for nothing. Then it opened fire. I will try to describe what I saw, though I do not think my words can fully capture it. The Thresher ships were built for endurance, layered with shielding meant to withstand sustained assault from multiple attackers over long periods. Our own encounters with them over the past 6 days had taught us that a full squadron working together for hours might eventually breach one of their shields. This single vessel breached 3 shields within moments, and did so almost quietly, as if the effort cost it nothing at all. I do not use the word violence lightly, and I want to be careful in how I describe this, because what I witnessed was not chaos, it was precision. Every strike landed exactly where it needed to land. Every maneuver avoided exactly what it needed to avoid. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no uncertainty. It reminded me less of a battle and more of a demonstration, the way a skilled craftsman might show a student exactly how a difficult task is done, calmly, without fear, without doubt. The Thresher commander's voice returned to the open channel, no longer calm. He demanded again that the vessel identify itself. This time a reply came, and it was the first human voice I had ever heard directly. It was a woman's voice, steady and unhurried, as if she had all the time in the world despite the battle unfolding around her ship. She said her name was Nora Bell, captain of the vessel, and that she had received a call for help from a station that the Thresher fleet was currently in the process of destroying. She said the call had been answered, and that the fleet had exactly one choice remaining, which was to withdraw immediately from the system. The Thresher commander laughed, a sound full of contempt, and told her that one ship, however strange its capabilities, could not hope to stand against an entire fleet forever, and that reinforcements would arrive long before she could hope to protect a station full of people who were already as good as gone. There was a pause on the channel, brief but heavy, and then Captain Bell spoke again. She said that reinforcements were welcome to come, and that she would still be there when they arrived. I do not know how to explain what that sentence did to those of us listening in the corridor. It was such a simple thing to say, yet it carried a weight I had not felt in 6 long days of silence from everyone else in the galaxy. It was not a promise built on treaty obligation or careful political calculation. It was simply a statement of fact from someone who had already decided what she was going to do, regardless of the cost. The battle continued outside, and I forced myself to keep working, helping Vesa move the remaining injured toward the shelter, checking what little power we had left, doing anything useful I could find to do. But part of my attention stayed locked on that open channel, listening to the sounds of Thresher ships losing ground against a single vessel that refused every offer to withdraw, every threat meant to frighten it away. At one point, Doran asked me quietly if I thought we would survive the day. I told him I did not know for certain, but that for the first time since this began, I believed it was possible, and that belief alone felt like more than I had been given in a very long time. By midday, 3 Thresher ships had been disabled completely, drifting powerless at the edge of the system. 2 more had withdrawn entirely, breaking formation and retreating faster than any calm, confident fleet should have needed to retreat from a single opponent. The Thresher commander's voice grew increasingly desperate over the open channel, no longer contemptuous, no longer certain of easy victory. He asked, finally, what kind of weapon this was, what kind of ship could fight an entire fleet and continue advancing without slowing. Captain Bell's answer was short, almost gentle in tone, though the words themselves carried a chill I still remember clearly. She said it was not a weapon. It was simply someone who had been asked for help and who had decided to give it. I sat back against the corridor wall, exhausted, frightened, and strangely hopeful all at once, and I understood for the first time that whatever humanity truly was, it was not what the rest of the galaxy had taught us to believe. It was not a danger to be kept carefully at a distance. It was something else entirely, something the galaxy perhaps feared precisely because it could not be controlled by treaty or convenience or careful diplomatic caution. It was something that answered when called, simply because it had chosen to, and asked for nothing in return except the chance to finish what it had started. By the time the remaining Thresher ships broke formation completely and scattered toward the far edge of the system, the station had grown quiet in a way I had almost forgotten was possible. No alarms, no impacts against the hull, just the low hum of failing systems slowly stabilizing as the pressure outside finally eased. Vesa was the first to laugh, a short, disbelieving sound that quickly turned into tears. The young boy she had been comforting for hours looked up at her, confused, and she pulled him close and told him it was all right now, that the danger had passed. Doran set his repaired lamp down carefully on the floor, as if satisfied that its small light no longer needed to compete with the sound of battle. I stayed at the console, watching Captain Bell's vessel approach Doris slowly, almost carefully, as though the ship that had just torn through a hostile fleet within minutes now wanted to be gentle with what remained of us. A docking request came through moments later, simple and direct, without any of the formal language the Orloon or Tanis representatives always used. It simply asked permission to dock and offer assistance. I granted it immediately. The docking clamps engaged with a soft mechanical sound, and for a long moment, none of us in the corridor moved. I think we were all afraid, in some quiet way, that this had been a dream, and that opening the airlock would break whatever fragile miracle had just saved us. When the airlock finally opened, I did not know what to expect. Some part of me, shaped by years of second-hand stories and cautious rumor, expected something imposing, something built to inspire fear even while at rest. Instead, a woman stepped through wearing a simple dark uniform, her expression calm, almost tired, the way anyone looks after a long and difficult task. She introduced herself as Nora Bell, and behind her came two others, a man named Daniel Cole and a woman named Grace Holt, both carrying medical equipment rather than weapons. I remember feeling confused by that. I had expected soldiers prepared for further conflict, not medics prepared to help the injured. Captain Bell noticed my confusion and said simply that the fighting was finished for now, and that helping the people who needed help came next. Vessa guided Grace Holt toward the shelter, and I watched as the human medic knelt beside an injured engineer, without hesitation, without any of the careful distance I might have expected from a species so unfamiliar with our kind. She worked quickly and gently, speaking softly to reassure a frightened patient, even though neither of them fully understood each other's language, beyond what the translation devices allowed. Daniel Cole approached me and asked about our remaining power systems, our life support levels, and how many people still needed to be moved to safety. His questions were practical, direct, entirely focused on solving problems rather than discussing what had just happened. I found myself answering just as directly, grateful for someone who wanted to act rather than explain. Captain Bell asked me to walk with her through the station, and I did, showing her the extent of the damage, the failing sections, the places where our people still waited for reassurance. She listened carefully to everything I said, occasionally asking short, clear questions, never once mentioning the battle outside, as though it had already become unimportant to her. I finally asked her the question that had been sitting in my chest since the moment her ship arrived. I asked why she came. I told her that no one else answered our call, that great powers with entire fleets found reasons to look away, and that we had never expected humanity, a species barely spoken of within full Concord councils, to be the one who arrived. She was quiet for a moment before answering. She said that her people had learned long ago what it cost to ignore someone crying for help, and that they had decided, collectively, many years before I was born, that they would rather be the ones who answered than the ones who found convenient reasons not to. I asked if the Concord would be upset that humanity had acted without any formal treaty obligation, without any council approval. She smiled slightly at that, though there was little humor in it. She said the Concord could discuss policy as much as it wished, but that discussion had never once stopped anyone from dying while it happened. I did not have a response to that. I simply nodded and continued walking beside her. We reached the observation deck, one of the few areas of the station still mostly intact, and looked out at the drifting wreckage of the disabled thresher ships. I asked her what would happen to them now. She said her crew would offer their remaining crews the option to surrender peacefully, and that those who accepted would be treated fairly, given medical attention if needed, and eventually return to their own territory once it was clear they no longer posed a danger to anyone else. I found this surprising. I had expected something harsher, given what I had witnessed during the battle. She noticed my surprise and explained, in the same calm, steady tone she had used throughout our conversation, that her people did not fight because they enjoyed fighting. They fought only when someone needed protecting, and stopped the moment that protection was no longer required. Anything beyond that, she said, was not help. It was simply more harm, and her people had learned the difference the hard way, long before I was ever born. I thought of the Thresher commander's voice from earlier, confident and contemptuous, certain that no single ship could stand against his entire fleet. I asked Captain Bell if she had known, before arriving, that she and her small crew could succeed against such numbers. She said she had not known for certain, but that the size of the risk had never been the deciding factor. The deciding factor had simply been that someone was in danger, and that mattered more than the odds against her. I sat with that answer for a long while after she moved on to check other parts of the station. It was such a simple way of thinking, and yet it explained everything about what I had witnessed, both the overwhelming silence from the great powers of the galaxy and the sudden, decisive action from a species most of us had been taught to view with careful suspicion. Later that evening, as repairs continued and the last of our injured were stabilized, I found Daniel Cole sitting quietly near one of the damaged corridors, running diagnostics on our failing power grid. I asked him what humanity's people back home would think of this mission, arriving without formal approval, risking so much for a station most of the galaxy had already written off as lost. He shrugged and said that back home, most people would probably never even hear about it. He said missions like this happened more often than outsiders realized, quiet and unannounced, without press coverage or official recognition, simply because someone had asked for help and someone else had decided to answer. I asked if that bothered him, doing something so significant without recognition. He looked at me for a moment, then said that recognition had never been the point. He said the point was that somewhere, people who had been ready to give up now had a chance to keep living, and that felt like enough of a reason on its own. I thought about the Orloon reply, careful and polite and empty. I thought about the Tanis reply, focused entirely on cost and risk. I thought about the silence from Velkar, who had signed a formal treaty and then simply chosen not to honor it when honoring it became inconvenient. And I thought about this quiet, unannounced arrival, a single ship and a small crew who had traveled an enormous distance, not because any law required it, but because they had decided, long before this moment, that ignoring a cry for help was simply not something they were willing to do. As night fell over the station, if night still meant anything at all, I stood at the observation deck once more and watched the human vessel resting quietly beside the wreckage of the fleet that had nearly destroyed us. I understood, finally, that the galaxy had been wrong about humanity in the most important way possible. They were not dangerous because they lacked control. They were dangerous only to those who threatened the people they had decided to protect, and gentle, endlessly patient toward everyone else. It was a strange thing to learn in the middle of so much loss, but I found myself grateful, more grateful than I had words for, that such a strange and unexpected people existed somewhere among the stars, ready to answer when the rest of the galaxy chose silence instead. 3 days after the battle above Doris, Captain Bell asked if I would join her aboard the human vessel for a short journey to a nearby relay point, where a larger human support ship was gathering the survivors from several other stations along the border. I agreed without hesitation. Vesa stayed behind to continue caring for the injured, and Doran remained as well, insisting that someone needed to keep fixing what could still be fixed. The inside of the human ship was smaller than I expected, given what it had accomplished during the battle. There were no grand halls, no displays of strength meant to impress visitors. Everything about it felt purposeful, built for function rather than appearance. Daniel Cole showed me to a small quarters near the rear of the ship and told me I was welcome to walk anywhere aboard that was not restricted for safety reasons. During the journey, I spent much of my time speaking with a young officer named Peter Grant, who managed communications aboard the vessel. He was younger than I expected, with an easy, open way of speaking that made it simple to ask him questions I might have hesitated to ask Captain Bell directly. I asked him about the old stories, the ones that spoke of a testing fleet from long ago that never returned after crossing into human space. He grew quieter than usual before answering. He said the full details of that event were still not widely shared, even among humans themselves, because the people who lived through it preferred not to speak of it often. What he could tell me was that it happened during a time when humanity had only just begun expanding beyond its home system, still uncertain of its place among the wider galaxy, and still carrying deep memories of conflicts fought entirely among themselves in the centuries before that. He explained that human history was filled with long periods of conflict between different nations of their own single world, conflicts that caused enormous suffering before finally being resolved through slow, difficult cooperation. He said that experience had left a lasting mark on how humanity approached danger. They had learned, at great cost, that ignoring a threat rarely made it disappear, and that waiting too long to act against clear danger almost always made the eventual cost higher for everyone involved. When the testing fleet arrived at the edge of human space, expecting an unprepared and vulnerable people, they instead found a species that had already spent generations learning exactly how quickly a threat needed to be answered and exactly how much hesitation could cost. Peter did not describe exactly what happened during that encounter, and I did not press him further, sensing that this was a subject his people still held carefully, not out of shame, but out of respect for how serious it had been. I asked him why, if humanity had shown such capability, the Concord had chosen distance instead of partnership. He considered the question for a while before answering. He said that most species in the Concord preferred predictability, alliances built on careful calculation and steady, controllable behavior. Humanity, he said, had never fit easily into that pattern, because their actions were guided less by calculation and more by conviction, and conviction was much harder for cautious diplomats to plan around. I thought about the Orloon Assembly, with their endless careful meetings, and the Tanis Combine, with their focus on cost and risk, and I began to understand why humanity made both of them uneasy. It was not that humanity lacked control. It was that humanity could not be relied upon to stay silent simply because silence was convenient, and that unpredictability, to cautious minds, felt more dangerous than any weapon. When we arrived at the relay point, I saw the true scale of what humanity had quietly been doing across this entire crisis. Several human vessels were gathered there, along with survivors from at least 4 other stations along the border that I had not even known were under attack. Grace Holt was already working among the newly arrived injured, alongside a small team led by a calm, steady woman named Laura Finch, who coordinated medical efforts across all the gathered ships without ever once raising her voice. I spoke with a survivor from one of the other stations, an elderly trader named Owen Pratt, who told me his own account of events. His station had sent a call for help through official Concord channels 3 separate times, receiving the same careful silence we had experienced at Doris. He said he had given up entirely, certain that his final days had arrived, until a single human vessel appeared without warning and began systematically disabling the thresher ships surrounding his station, one after another, with the same quiet precision I had witnessed myself. He told me something that stayed with me long afterward. He said that when he asked the human crew why they had come, none of them spoke of duty or treaty obligation. Each of them, in their own way, simply said that someone had needed help, and that mattered more than any formal reason to act. Later that day, I was permitted to view a private report Captain Bell had received from further along the border, detailing the wider collapse of Thresher military capability across the region. It was strange to read. There was no language celebrating destruction or victory. Instead, the report focused almost entirely on locations where remaining Thresher forces had been offered safe surrender, numbers of enemy personnel receiving medical treatment, and careful notes on ensuring captured territory would eventually be returned to stable, peaceful control rather than left in further chaos. I asked Captain Bell about this focus, and she explained that ending a threat did not mean creating a new one through carelessness afterward. She said humanity's approach had always been to remove the danger as completely and as quickly as possible, then work immediately towards stability, because unfinished conflicts had a way of becoming new conflicts later if left unresolved. I asked her directly whether her people ever felt troubled by the scale of force they were sometimes required to use. She paused for a long moment before answering, and when she did, her voice carried a weight I had not heard from her before. She said that every time force became necessary, it left something behind in the people who carried it out, a weight that never fully disappeared. She said her people did not pretend otherwise, and that anyone who claimed such actions cost nothing simply had not truly understood what they were describing. She said this was exactly why her people never acted first, and never acted more than necessary. The weight was too heavy to carry carelessly. That evening, word reached the relay point that representatives from both the Orloon Assembly and the Tanis Combine had formally requested contact with the human support fleet, expressing sudden interest in cooperative security discussions along the border. I watched Captain Bell read the message with an expression that revealed very little. She did not seem angry, only tired, in a way that suggested she had seen this pattern before. Peter Grant, standing nearby, remarked quietly that it was strange how quickly caution turned into friendly interest once danger had already been dealt with by someone else. Captain Bell did not respond to his comment directly, but I noticed she did not disagree with it either. I asked her whether humanity would accept these new requests for cooperation. She said her government back home would consider it carefully, weighing whether real partnership was being offered or simply convenient association after the fact. She said humanity had learned to watch actions far more closely than words, especially from those who had chosen silence when action mattered most. I found myself thinking of Doris, of the 6 days we spent sending calls into a galaxy that mostly chose not to answer, and of the single, unexpected voice that finally did. I understood now that this was not simply the story of one battle or one rescue. It was the story of an entire galaxy quietly deciding who it could rely on when everything else failed, and slowly, uncomfortably, learning that the answer was not who they had always assumed. As the relay point settled into a quiet evening, ships repairing, survivors resting, medics finishing their long hours of careful work, I stood once more at an observation window, watching the stars outside. Somewhere far beyond what I could see, other stations were likely sending their own desperate calls into the dark, hoping for an answer from powers who had learned to weigh risk before responding. I thought about what Peter Grant had told me, about a history shaped by long conflict and hard lessons, and about conviction being harder to calculate than caution. I thought about what Captain Bell had said, about weight that never fully disappeared once force became necessary, carried quietly by people who chose to act anyway because someone needed them to. For the first time since this entire crisis began, I found myself hoping not just for survival, but for understanding, hoping that the rest of the galaxy might finally learn what those of us at Doris now knew without any doubt at all. Somewhere among the stars, quietly, without needing recognition or treaty or careful political calculation, there existed a people who answered when called, and who understood, perhaps better than anyone else, exactly what it cost to be the ones who always did. 2 weeks after the fighting ended, I was asked to speak before an emergency session of the Concord Council, the same body that had received our original call for help, and answered it with careful excuses. I had never addressed such a gathering before, and I remember standing outside the chamber doors with Vesa beside me, feeling more nervous than I had during the worst hours aboard Doris. Vesa squeezed my hand and told me to simply speak the truth, plainly, without softening it for anyone's comfort. I told her I would try. The chamber was larger than I expected, filled with representatives from dozens of member species, including delegates from both the Orloon Assembly and the Tanis Combine. I noticed immediately that their manner had changed since the crisis. Where once their messages to us had been cautious and distant, their delegates now spoke warmly of solidarity, of shared values, of the importance of standing together against future threats. I listened to their opening remarks with a strange, hollow feeling, because I remembered exactly what those same voices had said when solidarity actually cost something. When my turn came to speak, I did not use prepared remarks. I simply told them what had happened at Doris, plainly, the way Vesa had suggested. I described the 6 days of silence, the polite refusals dressed in diplomatic language, the treaty obligations quietly abandoned the moment danger became inconvenient. I described the moment our call reached a species barely acknowledged within their own halls, and how that call had been answered within hours, without hesitation, without any demand for compensation or recognition. I watched the reactions across the chamber as I spoke. Some delegates looked uncomfortable, others looked away entirely. A few, mostly from smaller member worlds who had faced similar silence in the past, nodded slowly, as though finally hearing their own experience spoken aloud by someone else. A representative from the Orloon Assembly rose to respond, speaking carefully about the complexity of galactic politics, the difficulty of balancing multiple ongoing negotiations, and the unfortunate but understandable delays that sometimes occurred during such difficult periods. I listened patiently until he finished, then asked him a single question. I asked how many days he believed the people of Doris had left to live, at the moment his government chose to prioritize a negotiation happening in an entirely different part of the galaxy over an active call for help. He did not have an answer. I did not push further. I did not need to. The silence that followed my question said more than any argument I could have made. After the session, Captain Bell found me in one of the quiet corridors outside the main chamber. She told me she had watched a recording of my remarks, and that she was proud of how plainly I had spoken. I told her I had simply repeated what she and her crew had already shown through their actions, that words mattered less than choices, especially when someone's life depended on the outcome. She smiled slightly at that, though I noticed a familiar tiredness behind her expression, the same tiredness I had seen the day her ship first docked at Doris. I asked her if the Council's sudden interest in cooperation felt like progress to her. She said it might, eventually, if their actions ever matched their new words. She said humanity had learned to wait patiently for that kind of proof, because promises made after the danger had passed were the easiest kind to make and often the easiest kind to forget. I asked her what would happen next for her and her crew. She said their support fleet would remain in the region only long enough to ensure the affected stations were stable and safely rebuilding, and then they would return to answering whatever calls came next, wherever they came from. I asked if she knew where that might be. She said she did not yet, and that this uncertainty had never bothered her, because the call itself, whenever and wherever it came, would tell her everything she needed to know. In the days that followed, I returned to Doris to help with the long, slow work of rebuilding. Vesa remained in the medical bay, now assisted by 2 permanent staff from Laura Finch's team, who stayed behind at Captain Bell's request to help train our people in updated medical techniques. Doran continued his quiet habit of fixing small things throughout the station, though now he had far less damage to repair, and I noticed he seemed almost disappointed by how little there was left for him to fix. One evening, as repairs neared completion, I stood with Doran near the observation deck, watching the stars outside, calm now in a way they had not been for many long weeks. I asked him what he thought the galaxy had learned from everything that happened. He considered the question carefully before answering, the way he always did. He said he thought most of the galaxy would learn very little, at least for a while. He said great powers rarely changed their habits, simply because those habits were shown to be wrong once. He said real change usually came slowly, through many smaller moments like ours, each one chipping away a little more at old, comfortable assumptions. But he also said something else, something I have carried with me ever since. He said that even if the great powers never truly changed, it no longer mattered as much as it once did, because now we knew something we had not known before. We knew that somewhere among the stars, there existed a people willing to answer, regardless of how the rest of the galaxy behaved. That knowledge alone, he said, changed how frightening the silence of everyone else felt. I thought about that for a long while after he spoke. On the day the last human support ship finally prepared to leave our system, I went to the docking bay to see Captain Bell and her crew off. There was no formal ceremony arranged, no speeches prepared, no grand farewell befitting what they had done for us. I asked her if she wanted anything of that kind, some gesture of thanks worthy of everything her people had risked to save us. She shook her head gently and said that such gestures were kind, but unnecessary. She said her people did not answer calls for help, expecting gratitude in return, and that expecting anything in return would have changed the meaning of what they did in the first place. She said the only thing she truly hoped for was that we would remember, in the future, to answer calls of our own whenever the chance arose, because that, more than any ceremony, was how her people believed such debts were properly repaid. I promised her that we would remember. I meant it fully. Daniel Cole shook my hand before boarding, his grip firm and steady, and told me to take care of Vesa and Doran and everyone else who had made it through those difficult 6 days. Grace Holt embraced Vesa warmly before leaving, the two of them having grown close during the long hours spent caring for the injured together. Peter Grant offered a simple wave and a quiet smile, telling me he hoped our paths crossed again someday, under far calmer circumstances. I watched their ship undock slowly, without fanfare, its systems humming quietly as it prepared to depart our system entirely. There was no announcement of destination, no farewell broadcast to the wider Concord, nothing but a small, quiet vessel, slipping away from us just as unexpectedly as it had first arrived. Before the ship vanished fully from our sensors, one final message came through on the same private channel I had first used to call for help so many weeks earlier. It was brief, simple, and unmistakably Captain Bell's voice. She said that another call had come in from a different region of the galaxy, one facing a threat much like the one we had faced ourselves, and that she and her crew were already on their way to answer it. I sat alone at the console for a long while after her ship disappeared from view, thinking about everything that had happened since that first desperate transmission 6 days into an attack that had nearly ended everything we knew. I thought about the careful silence of powerful allies who had every resource needed to help us, and chose caution instead. I thought about the quiet, unannounced arrival of a species the galaxy had long treated with suspicion and distance, a species who came without needing to be formally asked, without demanding anything in return, simply because someone somewhere had needed help, and they had decided, long before any of us existed, that they would always be the ones who answered. I thought about Doran's words, about how the galaxy might change slowly, or perhaps not at all, and how that uncertainty no longer frightened me the way it once had, because now I understood something that 6 days of silence could never have taught me on its own. Help does not always come from the powers who promise it loudest, or from the treaties signed with the greatest ceremony, or from the councils who speak so warmly once danger has already passed. Sometimes help comes quietly, from the very place the galaxy least expected it, from a people who carry old, difficult histories they rarely speak of openly, and who learned long ago exactly what silence costs when someone needs saving. They do not ask to be called heroes. They do not require gratitude or recognition. They simply go where the call leads them, again and again without hesitation, because somewhere within them lives an old and simple truth that the rest of the galaxy has slowly forgotten. We had sent our call into a vast and silent galaxy, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer. The great powers, with all their fleets and treaties and careful diplomatic caution, chose silence instead. And from the one place none of us expected, from a small, distant world once viewed with fear and suspicion, came not silence, but something else entirely. They came without ceremony. They came without waiting to be formally asked. They came simply because someone needed them, and I have never in my life been more grateful for anything than I was to be saved that day by the very people the galaxy had quietly chosen to call monsters.